Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American-German Institute at Johns Hopkins University. And we are really pleased to present this discussion and presentation of research by Philip Nock. I will hand things over in a moment to my colleague, Peter Rashish, who is vice president of AGI and director of our Geoeconomics Program. To let him introduce our speaker and get us started. But I think, in a way, the title says it all, Transatlantic Cooperation in the Chip War. So we're going to be talking about one of the most important aspects of technological collaboration and strategic impact in the transatlantic partnership. And I'm really interested to hear Philip's research and get us started. So without further ado, let me hand it over to you, Peter, to take us through today's session.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning and afternoon or otherwise to all of you as well. Welcome to this webinar. I think it's fair to say that not only have microchips become the basic component of the digital transformation, but when we look at the interplay of the COVID pandemic, increasing geopolitical tensions with China, as well as some individual industrial actions, that all of these have led to a supply-demand imbalance and a very noticeable shortage of microchips. As a result, governments are beginning to rethink their existing policies and trying to reduce the technological dependencies that have become apparent. And in this process, the role of a collaborative approach between the United States and Germany is also becoming a key issue. During today's webinar, Philip Nock will explore the idea that Washington and Berlin need to enhance their tech cooperation and coordination to reduce vulnerabilities in semiconductor manufacturing and supplies. And he will also present recommendations to enhance policy coordination at the bilateral level, complementing the work that has been going on between the United States and the European Union in their Trade and Technology Council. Let me briefly introduce Philip. Philip Nock is a research fellow at the University of Bonn Center for Advanced Security, Strategic and Integration Studies, where he works on digital policies, weaponized independence, and semiconductor supply chain security initiatives. He holds a PhD scholarship from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, is part of the PhD study group Security and Development in the 21st Century of COS, and is a member of the research collective, the Second Cold War Observatory. His research interests in international relations lie at the nexus of economics, technology, and security policy. In his PhD, he's combining these by examining European policy responses to the weaponization of Sino-US interdependencies in the realm of semiconductor production networks. Philip holds a BA and an MA from the University of Bonn, during which time he also studied in St. Andrews and Toronto. After Philip's introductory remarks, I will launch a conversation with him and then look forward to opening up the floor to all of you. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab and I will get it to Philip. And with that, let me hand it over to you, Philip.
Thank you. Let me just put up my slide. So as Peter and Jeff said, my talk will be about transatlantic cooperation in the chip war, and particularly I will be doing an assessment of how the mapping is looking like, what reshoring projects are being pursued by the US American and the German government, then compare the strategic documents and legislation on this, and lastly develop and suggest policy recommendations for both governments to coordinate closer on this and enhance their bilateral policies on this. So The first thing is that I think Peter has already alluded to is that microchips have become the basic component of the digital transformation, and its manufacturing is heavily concentrated in East Asia. So particularly Taiwan and South Korea, China and Japan. The COVID-19 pandemic and as well as other factors like industrial miscalculation, the trade war between the US and China, as well as extreme weather events on Taiwan, led to the so-called chip shortage. And this affected over 150 sectors and industries worldwide, according to the Goldman Sachs report. And this then compelled governments around the globe to rethink and strive to reduce their technological interdependencies, which is basically the starting point and the central premise of this research project. I can't delve into all the steps of semiconductor production processes and the entire global value chain, but I think it's important to remind the audience that there are very few countries that are very central to these value chains. These are the US, China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the EU, and the UK. And in the EU, the Netherlands and Germany are the two most important countries whose industry is particularly important to equipment and tools as well as materials. And if we're looking at the US side, we see that the United States are very important for the EDA and design, also for equipment and tools, but less so when it comes to manufacturing. That also applies to Germany here. This is important for later on in the presentation. Then if we look at the numbers of manufacturing locations, so what we can see from 2000 to 2018 is that there's a significant drop both in the US and Japan, who were the premier industries in semiconductor production, and that the number of South Korea and Taiwan have increased, as well as obviously in China and Singapore. Yet just looking at the number of fabs, it doesn't really give you the full picture, because capacities, which is measured in thousands of 8-inch equivalent wafer starts per month, is where the real change was started. So if you compare the fab numbers, South Korea and Taiwan are not that far ahead, or have even fewer fabs than the US or Japan. But when it comes to the capacity, then the US and Japan have been overtaken by South Korea and Taiwan by the year 2010. And China has, in 2018, also overtaken the United States. Looking now at the whole of Europe, not just Germany, because there's not the data for that, but I think it's very meaningful that this is not an absolute decline, but a relative decline, but that the capacity is now on par with Singapore, the whole of Europe. And in 2018, this included the United Kingdom as well. Obviously, there's more to it, like which capacities and fabs are foreign-owned and so on. But just to give you some idea of how this geographic concentration to East Asia has shifted and what that means in terms of fabs and capacity. Now, talking about the expansion of the China semiconductor industry, it's important to notice that that Beijing, under the umbrella of the Made in China 2025 strategy and the dual circulation strategy, has invested approximately $123 billion in its domestic semiconductor industry, this for 2014 to 2021. And in 2020, at the start of the chip shortage, China bought more than half the global supply of chips, I think 53 percentage points. And this is interesting because, one, it shows that China is a large importer of chips, of course, but it shows also that China, while it does produce plenty of lower-end chips, it remains highly dependent on foreign chips and foreign-owned technologies for all advanced semiconductors. So there's a lot of money that the Chinese government invests there, and the Chinese industry applies this in research and development. There are usually some reports about how there are advances by the Chinese semiconductor industry, but not on a commercialization noteworthy level. And it's also interesting to see that in reaction to the Chips and Science Act, but also the announcement of the EU Chips Act, the Chinese government announced in 2022 to invest additional $143 billion in the chip industry for a 5-year period, focusing on advanced manufacturing. And this year it added further investments of $27 billion for chip making equipment to that. So just in terms of numbers, the amount that the Chinese government spends on this is very high, but it's not entirely the same value of money that the US American, South Korean, or Taiwanese investments get them. So probably this audience will ask themselves why the European semiconductor industry even matters. So this comes down to the IDMs, to equipment. So ASML has been very newsworthy, and the export restrictions that the Dutch government imposed last year on countries of concern for international security reasons, particularly on China, of course. Then there are also a lot of companies, particularly from Germany, like BASF and Merck, as well as Linde, which is now its main seat in Ireland, but has been a traditional German company. And also when it comes to wafers, Siltronic. So the supply and equipment is very important. It's very central what the European semiconductor industry brings to these global production processes. And that also gives the European government some kind of leverage on the industrial strategies and how to reorganize the supply chains. So the particular response to the strategic necessity to this shared vulnerability that was brought to the fore during the chip shortage is that the United States Congress enacted the Chips and Science Act in 2022 and the European Union, the EU Chips Act. There are a lot of similarities, which I will talk about in a minute, but also some differences. So basically, the assessment of the vulnerabilities is shared across the transatlantic community. And these shared vulnerabilities have led to shared strategic goals, in that sense that what both governments want to achieve in terms of manufacturing and also workforce cultivation is somewhat similar. This also gives you some possibility to coordinate, of course. Both CHIPS Acts provide vast public investments, which have been called unprecedented by observers. The United States spends $52 billion, while the EU spends 43 billion euros in their respective semiconductor ecosystems. So it's not just for manufacturing. A lot of it is also going to research and development and the materials and supply side. But again, giving these shared strategic goals, both have been also open to the involvement of like-minded partners, and the one that is mentioned usually first is Japan here. Yet there are also some differences. Particularly this applies to the competition laws and the institutional frameworks. So in the EU, the money is basically given out by member states' governments. Yet in all cases, the European Union has to, the competition authorities have to accept that there's an exception to the usual rules of the game, in the sense of, for instance, that it's a particularly innovative project that helps the European Union industrial base at a larger scale. And the second thing is that the Chips and Science Act provides actually new money and tax incentives, whereas the European Chips Act redirects funds from pre-existing programs like Horizon Europe and Digital Europe, and also it does not provide such tax incentives. So that's very important to note here. Then the second thing that has happened in this area is the founding of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, or short TTC, which in essence follows the aims to do no harm, establish lines of communications between both sides, and regain trust after the policy difference during the Trump administration and the obviously large upheavals of the chip shortage and the COVID-19 pandemic. And the main successes that the working group on semiconductors has established is to have reciprocal information sharing as well as a joint early warning mechanism. Yet there are to be done more important steps, which I will follow up in the policy recommendation part of this presentation. And in comparison to others, there's not so much a common framework like this the case in AI or substantial coordination measures, at least not publicly. So that's something to be thinking about. When we're mapping these, so this is a US mapping where I'm very thankful to our student assistant, Thomas. As you can see from this map that does include all expansions as well as entirely new fabs. There are significantly more in the US. The German ones, I will only focus on the bigger ones where we set the margin as exceeding $1 billion US dollars or euro government funding. So the largest projects are in Oregon, in California, in Arizona, Texas, Ohio, and New York, particularly upstate, and in Germany, in Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, Saxony-Anhalt, and Saarland. However, there are, I will go into more details on the numbers and what that means in the Transatlantic Perspectives essay, which will be published later this year. But in Germany, there are significant delays, both with the halt of building the fab in Magdeburg by Intel, as well as by Wolfspeed in Saarland, close to Saarbrücken. And these news actually are troubling in the sense that they put the European Commission's goals of doubling the share of European manufacturing of semiconductor chips by 2030 in jeopardy. And it's also at the moment quite unclear what will happen to those two plans, because the government funding, the subsidies are now in a part of a coalition fight, whether they will be left unused or whether they will be used for different purposes. And there has been like heavy criticism by the opposition party, the CDU, to what happens to this funding. When we now look at the total project, so the manufacturing investment by state, and by state I mean here by what happens in each state and what happens in each Bundesland. You can see that the geographic concentration is on places where there are pre-existing semiconductor companies and industry. So one of the assumptions before I went to the US was that this was not only to get good paying jobs and reshore the industry to the US, but also in some sense to cater to the base, particularly in swing states. Yet in the expert interviews I did, I couldn't find much evidence to uphold this assumption. So we see that it's widely divided. New York and California, obviously, very blue states, but with Texas and Ohio, very much more red states, and Arizona, obviously, one of the swing states. And the larger issue, I think, here, when looking at the policies, it's that this is called a matter of national security. So, for instance, Secretary Raimondo has been very vocal about it, that she used the threat towards Taiwan and what it means to global chip supplies to convince lawmakers from the other aisle to agree to the Chips and Science Act. And the national security strategy of the Biden administration does recognize that, and actually calls it very important to keep these supplies resilient and secure, both to US competitiveness and national security. And for that reason, it commits itself to reinvigorate its domestic semiconductor industry and emphasize the cooperation with like-minded actors, and there puts a particular emphasis on the TTC. Meanwhile, the German national security, which was, of course, the first one that was ever published by the federal government, with a broad understanding of security, including supply chain security. For instance, Secretary Baerbock even mentions that it needs to keep reliable supply of chips happening to secure that everybody has functioning smartphones. So a very human security approach in that sense, if you can say that about economic security issues. And there are several commitments to the rule-based international order as the basis of the German economy, competitiveness and resilience. And this is particularly about open access to capital, to both financial and human capital, but also to technologies, to markets, and trade. And the last point I want to highlight here are the security risks of economic dependencies and the intensified technological competition that the security strategy is very vocal about. And that also is kind of what constitutes not just the assertive role of China, but obviously also the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which are used as a rationale to justify these policy changes. So the second dimension is obviously the key issue that this poses for industrial strategy. The Bidenomics don't have this single strategic document that lays this out, but I would say that 5 congressional bills or 4 congressional bills are central to the Biden administration's industrial strategy: the American Rescue Plan, the IRA, the Chips and Science Act, of course, and sorry, there was a short mistake. That what I think is also very important about Bidenomics is the focus on connecting technological leadership when it comes to semiconductors, to AI and quantum computing, to supply chain security and bringing back manufacturing jobs. So that's the rationale to invest such heavy public money. And in Germany, the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action has laid out an industrial policy in the Zeitenwende, and this reflects new priorities, so economic security, of course, which are also heavily argumented by the assertive role of China, as well as the situation in Ukraine and the Russian threat to the European peace and security. But also there's a new priority of protecting domestic industry from unfair competition, particularly in light of the transformation linked to the digital transformation, but also to climate protection. And lastly, as we can see from two ministers that have been part of the, or like leading on the national security strategy and the industrial strategy, being from the Greens, on just transition and how the upheavals of these huge transformation projects in the 2020s can be made more just and socially acceptable. And the strategic approach that the industrial strategy of the Federal Republic lays out is to always look towards Europe, to strengthen the German locations, and pursue an active funding policy. And I think what's quite important about the strategy is that it highlights that not everything needs to be produced or manufactured in Germany, but particularly whether a German company is part of a project in France, or even with like-minded partners like in East Asia or the Global South or the US, that's fine, but that there has to be always an assessment how this affects economic security. And the strategy was also quite vocal about the implications this has for the ordoliberal social market economy of Germany. So to summarize, my own analysis and expert interviews suggest that the Commission's goal to double the EU share of global food chip production is quite unrealistic. I would argue that the US government's ambitions are more feasible, but the time span this will require is larger than just this decade. As you can see from the numbers I put about fab locations and capacity, it's a decades-long process, and to basically reshore or like at least diversify in a significant way, this probably needs a comparable amount of time. Secondly, was not meaning exactly the same, and being mindful of the individual economies, interdependencies, and the private sector needs. The US and Germany, in its current constellations, have found a common language on de-risking economic independence with China, and how to approach the economic security agenda, whilst also having some differences of opinion. What I think is quite important to note here is that there is, however, a different assessment or perception of the purpose of the Trade and Technology Council. The United States has a much more China-centric outlook on this, while Germany and the EU have a more general approach. One of the interviews I did called it even a replacement for TTIP in European eyes. So I thought that was a quite interesting quote. So my policy recommendations multilaterally are to be open to discuss structural changes to the TTC, however the presidential election will turn out. Yet there is a clear necessity to have such a forum per se, and whether that's even called the TTC or whether you can reduce the working groups that are regularly meeting and work more with ad hoc working groups. I think that's up for debate, but such a forum has proven valuable to establish lines of communications and coordinate on issues and largely follow at least the mantra of doing no harm. However, there has been not so much coordination on industrial policy per se. So given the semiconductor working group in particular, there should be an extension of the current arrangements on information sharing and the joint early warning mechanism. Yet, at least publicly, there seems to be that not much has been happening in the last year. So there is a chance to lose some momentum on this. And the EU and its member states need to address the lack of human resources in their administrations, while the Chips and Science Act, as well as the project by the State Departments, have given the human capacities and human resources that are needed to the United States. This is not the case in Europe. And basically, their officials have to deal not just with semiconductors or not just supply chain security, but with much larger portfolios, making it problematic capacity-wise. I think the next very important issue is to closely coordinate on outbound investment screenings. There's a executive order by President Biden from last year out. Whether Congress acts upon it is to be seen. And on the European side, it's mentioned in the EU economic security strategy, but there is a problem, or like there are a lot of ongoing discussions, but how it will adopt to this is up for discussion, and I think this should be closely exchanged with US American partners. And think what should add to that is to where the EU and the United States can't agree to engage in issues on this multilateral basis. This should be complemented by minilateral formats like the G7 plus or any other issue, and particularly South Korea and Australia should be involved in this. And for the bilateral level, the German government faces similar capacity issues in terms of human resources to the EU, so this needs to be addressed. Secondly, the signaling from both Berlin and Washington, what kind of division of labor can be agreed upon in line with existing industrial strengths and coordination with other partners is very important. It's not to say that every industrial policy coordination measure is good, and in the past, obviously, there have been huge mistakes on this, and it's important to be mindful of that. But how the this era of geoeconomics and the Chinese party-state capitalism has changed the rules of the game, mandates to be active in this. Thirdly, I would encourage both Washington and Berlin to harmonize export restrictions as much as possible. It also is not just helpful in terms of having laid out more common rules and agreeing on this, but also for the private sector, makes it much more easier to engage in business activities across the pond. And my last bilateral policy recommendation is to use the existing channels, but like with the EU, where possible, to engage also not just bilaterally, but also in multilateral fora where appropriate. And given a question Peter posed to me, my outlook is that the EU should probably does not have the right model at the time. It should more emulate the Japanese concept of maintaining, boosting, and obtaining strategic indispensability. So to focus on existing strengths and how to build upon them. And given the case of a second Trump administration, the expert interviews and talks I've had in DC since coming here in September reveal an uncertain future for the TTC. But there's a clear consensus that there would be a more unilateral approach, and interview partners have even suggested that the TTC would be a done deal if President Trump came a second time to office. What happens in case of a Harris presidency is there's no clear consensus. Obviously, this means a larger measure of continuation of the existing policies. But what we see from this campaign and on trade and technology issues at large is that President Harris would probably be more focused on the domestic agenda. Yet I would, for instance, see no uncertain future for the TCC at all, even though there would be probably some reform and restructuring in some sense. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thanks very much, Philip, for that. And let me remind everyone, I do see some questions coming in, but if you'd like to ask one, please use the Q&A tab. It's probably at the bottom of your screen. Let me start off with one or two questions of my own. Since the main, although not the sole focus of your remarks, are the U.S., the roles of the U.S. and Germany, what would you say, our viewers should take away when you think of the German semiconductor industry and its role in the strategies that you've talked about? In other words, what kind of where are the strengths? What kind of efforts has the German government placed in R&D, for example? What is the landscape of German firms? You mentioned that a bit in one of your slides, but where are the strengths and weaknesses of German industry, and what do those imply for future policy coordination?
So the strengths of German industry are particularly regarding integrated device manufacturers, so regarding automotive IC supply, regarding equipment, so particularly when it comes to optics, for instance. So basically all the machines of ASML wouldn't work without the supply and cooperation with Zeiss, for instance, a German company. The other bit is that chemicals are very important. So when we talk about critical raw materials, we usually talk about rare earths being mainly from the People's Republic of China. Yet then continuation or manufacture or like processing of silicium is much more based in South Korea and in Germany. So basically the Chinese industry does not have the capacity to do this on the highest level. So that's what I would call the strengths. And this is also, for instance, particularly noteworthy for the EV discussions we had in the last couple of weeks. So while overall the German automotive industry has kind of lost some edge when it comes to EV, both to US American companies, but also to Chinese competitors, when it comes to these automotive IC integrated circuits supply, that's still a strength. And companies that are important to that are Bosch, Infineon. I've mentioned Zeiss when it comes to optics, Aixtron to equipment. In terms of chemicals, BASF and Merck, as well as Linde, are important when it comes to wafers, particularly Siltronic is mentioned, is noteworthy.
Great. During your talk, you mentioned the US-EU Trade and Technology Council a few times, and you talked about what its future might look like after the US election. Let me ask you, what are the relative strengths of the TTC versus boosting US-German bilateral cooperation? I mean that in two ways. One is because of the sort of the competences of the European Union. For example, you mentioned export controls, which is a very national, very much a member state responsibility, but also a little bit in a political lens, looking at the possible outcomes of the US election, looking at the fact that there's going to be a German election next year. Do you think that there should be a more conscious attempt to strengthen the bilateral channel, or at least where are the strengths, particular strengths of that channel compared to the TTC?
I mean, the bilateral channels have been more a longer time existing, have been used for a range of issues, but it depends very much on where agreements can be found. And the TTC obviously only works as long as as both sides support it, while the bilateral engagement is happening on senior level. Given that this is a public webinar, I'm mindful what I can say about this from my background talks, but the thing is that in case of a Trump in the second Trump term, the bilateral level importance would obviously rise, and I think then would we talk less about coordinating industrial policy, but seeing where the second Trump admin would find ways to weaponize interdependencies, and how much agreement can be found on China policy. Obviously, people from the Biden administration that I've talked to, particularly from the Department of Commerce and State Department, are not only engaged on China, but highlight the importance of all of these issues also with the look to Ukraine and the Russian invasion. And largely, I'd say that the differences in terms of languages, in outlooks, and so on over the last 5 years have significantly been reduced. So whether the Trump administration engages much more with the EU or not, I think that they will find that the first term brought forward this notion of economic security, and that the agenda is more widely shared by I'd say like more traditional partners from the Indo-Pacific, but also across Europe.
Okay, thanks. Earlier in your talk, you had some slides which had to do with the kind of geography of chip manufacturing and the changes over time in different locations. Looking forward, what do you think is the time frame that we need to be talking about for sort of diversification and perhaps also some reshoring of chip manufacturing when we look at where compared to where it stands now and the concerns we have about concentration?
I mean, a huge concern of both sides is the Chinese in investments, and that China might actually take a technological leadership role in the semiconductor industry. So there is the more pronounced systemic competition dimension, but the issue with geographic concentration goes larger than that. I mean, South Korea and Taiwan are hugely important regarding semiconductor production, particularly the most advanced chips, in the sense of being also the smallest with 2 or 3 nanometers. And both have a very volatile geopolitical environment. So Taiwan was obviously the conflict with mainland China, while South Korea and North Korea have also a problem. And if there's like a significant geopolitical development, this could lead to another chip shortage in some sense, because so much production is taking place over there. And that's the larger rationale to both European and US American lawmakers to heavily invest in these fabs in not just their domestic ecosystems, but also with like-minded partners in friendly countries. And I think the issue is also in some sense that there are a lot of people saying that the West has been naive about this. I think the assessment of outgoing Commissioner Vestager is quite true as well. That it's not just naivety, but also in some sense greed, because it was a business model that was working well for Europeans to just get the chip supply from East Asia. Yet we see that just-in-time production is somewhat problematic when it comes to security and resilience of such such capital and know-how intensive and transnational supply chains. Yet I would also say that there's some sense of focusing, or like it's the focus on just resilience and more even distribution, that there's some sense of going back towards the original model of lean production networks.
Okay, thank you. I want to take one question from viewers and then maybe also add something to it. The question is looking at the election on surprisingly, it's 2 weeks away. And the question is, do you think the current U.S. supply chain policy will survive the election? I guess that could apply to either a Harris or a Trump administration, maybe particularly to a Trump administration. And I would like to add to that, that you mentioned that in the Trump scenario, you thought is unlikely that the US-EU Trade and Technology Council would survive. So I guess my kind of add-on to the question would be, whatever U.S. supply chain policy looks like after the election, and whoever is president, will there be some imperative to cooperate with allies on that? And if so, if there's no TTC, do you think there'll be some efforts to find other ways, maybe more ad hoc ways?
Well, no country, even the United States, does even come close to being self-reliant or autonomous in the production of semiconductors. So there's an imperative to work with other countries, particularly their partners. So given that Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the EU, and the UK all have close ties to the US, it's obviously an advantage, which is very much stretched by the Biden administration. So there is this imperative. However, I would agree that there's not a clear-cut way how the Trump administration policy on supply chain would look like. One interview of mine suggested that actually his prognosis on the Trump administration would be to focus more on tax cuts and social policies rather than reshoring and reindustrializing the US, in that sense that it's more campaign issue. I'm not necessarily taking that view, but I think it was interesting to mention here. And what's also important to understand is that the Chips and Science Act, for instance, will go for or even exceed the next term of the presidency. So in that sense, the projects will be ongoing, the funding is secured, and there's not so much that a next president could change about it, because it's a bipartisan law. I don't see that would change. And there are also institutional arrangements like the supply chain center at the Department of Commerce, where I don't foresee that this would change. However, the priorities, for instance, to work with Europeans more closely on that, I would say that probably Trump administration would be more focused on Taiwan, more on South Korea and Japan, and looking how to get these countries that have more choke points, as the IR literature says, and are more central to the manufacturing process. I would clearly see that, yeah.
Thanks. Another question that has come in asks, what are the main differences between U.S. and German chip export restrictions, and what is the outlook for reconciling any differences that exist?
Was this with respect to Germany or the EU? Sorry.
This was the differences between the U.S. and Germany in terms of their chip export restrictions.
I mean, there are always secondary sanctions to be mindful of. So if US American citizens are involved, this kind of gives the US the jurisdiction to go in and impose sanctions. Yet the Biden administration is very careful to not use this as leverage, but rather convince their partners to enact trade restrictions. The most publicly discussed cases, obviously, the Dutch and Japanese restrictions on lithography systems, particularly with emphasis on ASML and Tokyo Electron. Yet I would say that the export restrictions in the US are further developed in the sense that the US has been the first mover here and at large is convincing its partners to move there, and even associations are calling for it to be more similar in the sense that it gives them regulatory security and knowing how to handle it, and even would be a better climate for investments.
You also mentioned when you were talking about the different fora available for cooperation, you mentioned the idea of a G7 plus. Now, that idea, I think, is gaining some traction as a way to broaden kind of the US, European approach to a number of issues in the global economy. Where do you, let's say, both where do you see the most potential for getting traction with that G7 plus group of countries, and which countries do you think are particularly important to have inside that in that grouping?
I think the most important country when it comes to semiconductors is South Korea. Not just giving the importance of Samsung, but in a lot of the there's huge importance when it comes to dynamic random access memories, when it comes to the front end and back end part of manufacturing. So South Korea is very much involved in large amounts of value chain activities, and their companies can only are usually referred to as lead companies. So that's most important. I think what's also should be taken into consideration are countries which have the critical raw materials necessary for the semiconductor production. So Australia is particularly important. A couple of South American countries like Chile, for example, or South Africa in Africa. I think it usually depends on which part of the semiconductor value chain or supply chain you're looking at. But these are the most important countries. Also, Israel and Malaysia have some manufacturing capacities. So to build upon that would also help in the sense of diversification of the supply chain. But as I've mentioned, there are only half a dozen countries that are currently holding leverage on semiconductor production, have this ability to weaponize interdependencies themselves and not just of being weaponized. And in that sense, these are the most important partners for the US.
Got it. In your talk, you referred to the U.S. and first German national security strategies, and I thought it was interesting because you explicitly mention that on the U.S. side, there was that the U.S.-EU Trade and Technology Council was highlighted, and then you kind of, as a kind of comparison, you said that on the German side, the rules-based international order was a key feature, which leads me to ask: can you let's assume some continuity, just for the sake of the question and answer on both sides of, over the next several years. Could you imagine an area that is in the focus of your talk and of your research, where this US-EU preference, let's call it, versus a kind of global or multilateral preference, you might call it, on the German side, could lead to conflict when it comes to actually developing common policies and implementing them?
Yes, and I would say that both the national security strategy as well as the industrial policy by the BMWK addresses in some sense. There's no absolute guideline what is to be followed, but for instance, the industrial strategy is very clear that the industrial policy by Germany needs to be Europe oriented. However, I think it depends on individual cases. To use another example, for instance, ASML actually was allowed to circumvent Dutch labor laws when it came to employing people from countries of concern like China, Russia, or Iran, as the industry was called so important and beneficial to competitiveness as well as protecting international security, that there's actually Dutch judicial case where their policies, due to secondary sanctions by the US, allowed them to neglect this labor law standards.
Well, Philip, thank you very much for this deep dive into the issues, and also for the forward-looking elements in your presentation, trying to look at where the US and Germany and the EU might be going on these issues, and in various political and other constellations. In case I neglected to mention it at the start, I should say that Philip is with us as a DAAD AGI research fellow for a couple of months. We've been very pleased to have you with us. Look forward to what you will be doing after you leave us. And so let me thank you very much for being with us and for this presentation. Let me also thank all of the viewers and for their questions. I think it's been a great discussion. I've definitely learned a lot, and we look forward to having you back virtually at AGI sometime very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.